One of the greatest frustrations for a narcissist is encountering a woman who cannot be psychologically captured. That is the real issue at the center of this discussion. Narcissism survives through influence, through emotional dependency, through the subtle reshaping of another person's perception of reality. The narcissist does not merely want admiration, he wants authority over the emotional climate of another human being. He wants to become the source of validation, identity, and even self-worth. And this is precisely why a virtuous woman becomes such a profound threat to him. Now, when we use the word virtue, we must rescue it from the shallow meanings modern culture often assigns to it. Virtue is not weakness. It is not passivity. It is not merely politeness or outward morality. Virtue, in the deeper classical sense, is inner order. It is the disciplined alignment of character with truth. A virtuous woman is dangerous to manipulation because she possesses something the narcissist cannot easily penetrate: a stable center. Most manipulation works by creating confusion. The narcissist studies emotional reactions carefully. He learns what produces guilt, fear, insecurity, or self-doubt. He understands that if he can destabilize your inner world, he can gradually influence your decisions. That is why narcissistic relationships often feel psychologically exhausting. The victim begins questioning their own memory, instincts, and judgment. Reality becomes blurred. But a virtuous woman does not build her identity upon the shifting opinions of others. Her sense of self is rooted in principles rather than emotional dependency. She may feel pain, certainly. She may experience disappointment, betrayal, or grief. But she does not surrender her perception of reality simply because someone pressures her emotionally. This becomes deeply unsettling to the narcissist because his usual methods begin to fail. You see, manipulation requires access points. Vanity is an access point. Desperation for approval is another. Fear of loneliness is perhaps the most powerful of all. When a person cannot bear rejection, they become vulnerable to almost any form of emotional control. The narcissist knows this instinctively. He offers affection and removes it. He praises and then humiliates. He creates emotional instability because instability produces dependency. Yet virtue creates ease resistance against this entire cycle. A woman with integrity is not easily intoxicated by charm because she watches behavior more carefully than appearances. She understands that consistency matters more than charisma. She listens beyond words. And perhaps most importantly, she is willing to face uncomfortable truths instead of escaping into comforting illusions. That last point matters enormously. Many people remain trapped in toxic relationships not because they cannot see the truth, but because they fear the consequences of accepting it. Truth demands action. Truth may require walking away. Truth may require loneliness before healing. A virtuous woman possesses the moral courage to endure temporary pain rather than permanent deception. And this courage dismantles the narcissist's strongest weapon: psychological control through fear. There is also another dimension here that is often overlooked. Narcissists are deeply dependent people, though they appear powerful on the surface. Their confidence is usually theatrical rather than authentic. They rely constantly on external admiration to sustain their fragile sense of self. In many ways, they are emotionally starving individuals. Mules attempting to feed upon the attention, insecurity, and emotional energy of others. But a virtuous woman refuses to become emotional fuel for another person's ego. She does not need to win every argument. She does not need revenge. She does not collapse under emotional intimidation. Her strength comes from self-mastery, and self-mastery is something the narcissist rarely understands because he is governed almost entirely by appetite for control, attention, superiority, and validation. And this is why the narcissist often grows increasingly hostile when he realizes he cannot dominate her psychologically. Her calmness exposes his chaos. Her clarity exposes his contradictions. Her discipline exposes his emotional instability. Without intending to, she becomes a mirror reflecting the very truths he spends his life trying to avoid. In the end, the virtuous woman defeats manipulation not through aggression, but through unwavering alignment with truth. She cannot be easily controlled because she has already conquered something far more difficult, herself. And a person who governs their own soul becomes nearly impossible for another person to enslave. There is something, Paige, profoundly unsettling about being truly seen. Most human beings, to some extent, survive through carefully managed appearances. We all present edited versions of ourselves to the world. But the narcissist depends upon this illusion in a far deeper way. His entire identity is often constructed around image rather than substance. He must appear superior, admirable, intelligent, desirable, or morally untouchable because beneath that performance lies an unbearable insecurity he cannot face directly. This is why truth becomes such a threat to him. And a virtuous woman, whether she intends to or not, has a remarkable ability to expose falsehood simply through her relationship with reality. She does not worship appearances. She does not confuse charm with character. She pays attention to patterns, not performances. In a culture hypnotized by charisma, this kind of discernment becomes extraordinarily rare. The narcissist survives by controlling perception. He wants to dictate how others see him, how conflicts are interpreted, and even how reality itself is remembered. This is why so many people who encounter narcissistic personalities eventually begin doubting their own instincts. The manipulation is often subtle at first. Facts are denied. Intentions are twisted. Emotional reactions are weaponized. Over time, confusion becomes a form of imprisonment. But a virtuous woman possesses a deep loyalty to truth, even when truth is inconvenient. That loyalty changes everything. She notices inconsistencies others ignore. She observes the difference between public kindness and private cruelty. She recognizes when apologies are performances rather than repentance. Most importantly, she understands that words alone are meaningless when disconnected from consistent action. This is where the narcissist begins to lose control. You see, narcissistic individuals often rely upon emotional fog. If they can keep people emotionally reactive, distracted, insecure, or desperate for approval, then clear judgment becomes difficult. But virtue creates clarity because virtue requires honesty first with oneself. And a person unwilling to lie to themselves becomes very difficult to deceive. Now, this does not mean the virtuous woman is cold or cynical, quite the opposite. She may be compassionate, patient, and deeply empathetic. But empathy without discernment becomes self-destruction. One of the greatest mistakes people make is assuming goodness means endless tolerance for harmful behavior. It does not. Genuine goodness is inseparable from truth. In fact, truth is what gives goodness its strength. C.S. Lewis once suggested that morality is not merely about being nice, it is about becoming aligned with reality itself. And this is precisely why narcissists struggle around people of genuine character. The narcissist wants admiration without accountability. He wants the rewards of virtue without the sacrifice virtue requires. He wants trust without honesty, loyalty without integrity, intimacy without vulnerability. But reality eventually exposes all contradictions. A virtuous woman understands this at a deep level. She does not need to launch attacks or public humiliations. She does not need endless arguments. Often her greatest power lies in simple observation. She sees what is there. And once she sees it clearly, she refuses to participate in the illusion any longer. That refusal alone is devastating to the narcissist. Because narcissists depend upon agreement, not necessarily spoken agreement, but psychological agreement. They need others to participate in the false narrative they have constructed. The moment someone calmly steps outside that narrative, the entire structure begins to tremble. Have you noticed how narcissists often become most aggressive when they are calmly confronted with truth? Not rage, not revenge, not emotional chaos, just truth. Simple, undeniable truth. This is because truth threatens the identity they have spent years constructing, and deep down they know it. The virtuous woman becomes dangerous precisely because she cannot be easily hypnotized by appearances. She understands that real character reveals itself over time, especially under pressure. Anyone can appear loving when conditions are easy. Anyone can perform confidence in public, but adversity exposes integrity. Conflict reveals emotional maturity. Power reveals morality. And she watches these things carefully. In many cases, the narcissist mistakes kindness for weakness. He assumes patience means blindness. He believes charm can permanently override reality. But eventually he encounters someone whose inner compass is too anchored to be manipulated indefinitely. Someone who values truth more than comfort. Someone who would rather endure disappoint me, not than live inside deception. That is when the mask begins to crack. And perhaps the most important lesson here is this. Truth does not merely expose darkness in others, it protects the soul of the person courageous enough to face it. Because every time we deny reality to preserve comfort, we surrender a piece of our freedom. The virtuous woman refuses that bargain. And in a world built increasingly upon illusion, the person who remains loyal to truth becomes almost impossible to conquer. At the heart of every narcissistic dynamic lies a hidden transaction. It is rarely spoken aloud, yet it governs the entire relationship. The narcissist offers attention, approval, affection, or validation in exchange for psychological dependence. In other words, he does not simply want to be loved, he wants to become necessary. That distinction matters enormously. Because once a person believes they cannot emotionally survive without someone's approval, manipulation becomes remarkably easy. This is why self-worth becomes one of the greatest threats to narcissistic control. A virtuous woman understands something many people spend years trying to learn. Her value does not originate from external, banal admiration. It does not fluctuate according to how desired she feels, how praised she is, or whether someone chooses to stay. Her dignity is not negotiable because it is rooted in something deeper than emotional attention. And when a woman possesses that kind of inner grounding, the narcissist loses access to his primary source of power. You see, narcissistic personalities are extraordinarily skilled at identifying emotional hunger in others. They can sense insecurity with almost surgical precision. A person desperate to feel chosen, validated, or worthy becomes vulnerable to manipulation because fear begins to override discernment. Fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of being alone. These fears create emotional dependency, and dependency creates control. This is why narcissistic relationships often begin with intensity rather than stability. The affection feels overwhelming, immediate, intoxicating. The narcissist studies the other person carefully and mirrors their desires back to them. He becomes whatever they long to find. In many cases, the victim feels emotionally understood for the first time in years, but this connection is often conditional from the beginning. The admiration is given strategically and withdrawn strategically. Praise becomes a tool. Attention becomes a reward. Silence becomes punishment. Over time, the victim begins organizing their emotional life around regaining the narcissist's approval. And without realizing it, they slowly abandon themselves.
What's it
A
called?
virtuous woman resists this process because she refuses to build her
Aloco.
identity upon another
Is it
person's
sweet or-
frustration.
It's both.
Now, this
It
does
can
not
be
mean she is
sweet
arrogant or
salty.
emotionally
And
detached.
sometimes it comes
True
with a
self-worth
spicy
is not
sauce.
pride.
Spicy.
Pride
Loco
depends on
sounds delicious,
superiority.
Zenobia. We'd love to try
Self-worth
it
depends on
sometime.
truth.
Yeah, there's plenty of
It is the
plantain
quiet
at the local
recognition
supermarket
that
you
one's
can pick up.
dignity exists
It
independent
really
of
is
external
wonderful.
applause.
They've got such a
A
variety
virtuous
there.
woman may desire
Zen,
love
you've
deeply,
got to
but she
try
does not
strawberry
worship it.
Pop-Tarts.
She may
Strawberry,
value
actually
companionship,
blueberry
but she does
Pop-Tarts
not
are the best
sacrifice
ones.
her
You two
moral
are both
clarity to
wrong,
preserve
Zen.
it.
Clearly
That
there's
How
difference
about
changes
we
everything.
have real
The
berries?
narcissist expects emotional bargaining. He expects guilt to work. He expects fear to work. He expects withdrawal, manipulation, and confusion to pull the other person back into dependence. But when he encounters a woman who would rather walk away than betray her own dignity, he faces something he cannot easily control. This is often where the narcissist becomes most destabilized. Because beneath the grandiosity, narcissists are profoundly dependent people themselves. They require constant emotional supply from others to maintain their fragile self-image. Admiration, attention, obedience, emotional reactions, these things become psychological fuel. Without them, the narcissist is forced into proximity with the emptiness he spends his life avoiding. A virtuous woman disrupts this entire system because she does not feed it endlessly. She does not chase endlessly after emotional crumbs. She does not abandon her standards simply to keep peace. And perhaps most importantly, she is willing to tolerate solitude rather than remain imprisoned inside emotional dysfunction. That willingness is a form of freedom many people never develop. Modern culture often treats loneliness as the ultimate catastrophe. And because people fear loneliness so deeply, they tolerate relationships that slowly destroy their spirit. They remain in environments filled with disrespect, manipulation, and emotional instability because temporary attachment feels safer than temporary solitude. But there is a profound difference between being alone and being diminished. The virtuous woman understands this. She recognizes that a relationship which requires the destruction of self-respect is not love at all. It is captivity disguised as intimacy. And once a person truly understands their own worth, manipulation begins losing its effect. Insults no longer define them. Emotional withdrawal no longer controls them. False guilt no longer enslaves them. The narcissist may still attempt his usual tactics, but they no longer reach the center of the person he is trying to dominate. This is why narcissists often become enraged when someone finally develops self-respect. What they truly fear is not rebellion, it is independence. Independence means the loss of control. It means the other person no longer needs the illusion being offered. And that is the deeper lesson here. Self-worth is not merely emotional confidence. It is spiritual independence. It is the refusal to hand another human being authority over your identity. Because the moment you understand your value clearly, you stop begging for what should never require negotiation. Respect, honesty, and genuine love. And the person who no longer needs permission. To value themselves becomes extraordinarily difficult to manipulate. Perhaps the final thing a narcissist expects to encounter is quiet strength. Not emotional chaos, not revenge. Not screaming arguments or dramatic ultimatums. Those things, strange as it may sound, are often easier for the narcissist to manage because they still provide emotional engagement. They still create reaction, and reaction is a form of connection the narcissist can manipulate. What truly unsettles him is emotional discipline. A virtuous woman understands that not every battle deserves participation. She recognizes that peace is not weakness, it is control over oneself. And that kind of control becomes deeply threatening to individuals who depend upon emotional disorder to maintain influence. Narcissistic behavior thrives in confusion. The narcissist creates tension deliberately because tension weakens clarity. If he can provoke insecurity, anger, guilt, or emotional exhaustion, then the other person becomes easier to dominate psychologically. This is why many narcissistic relationships feel like endless emotional turbulence. There is always another misunderstanding, another crisis, another shifting standard that keeps the victim emotionally off balance. But discipline interrupts this cycle. And discipline, in the deepest sense, is not merely external restraint. It is inner government. It is the ability to refuse impulses that would compromise one's integrity or peace of mind. A virtuous woman possesses this kind of strength because she understands something essential. Emotional reactions are often the doorway through which manipulation enters. Now, this does not mean she becomes cold or emotionless, quite the opposite. She may feel deeply wounded, she may experience heartbreak, disappointment, even anger. But she refuses to let those emotions govern her actions blindly. She pauses. She observes. She chooses her response rather than surrendering herself to impulse. That alone dismantles much of the narcissist's power. You see, narcissists often rely upon provoking emotional instability in others because emotionally destabilized people become predictable. Anger clouds judgment. Desperation weakens boundaries. Fear creates compliance. But when a person remains calm, thoughtful, and emotionally anchored, manipulation begins to lose momentum. This is why boundaries become so important. A boundary is not punishment. It is not cruelty. It is the recognition that love without limits becomes self-destruction. Many people misunderstand boundaries because they have confused kindness with self-sacrifice. They believe enduring endless disrespect somehow proves moral virtue. But genuine virtue does not require surrendering one's dignity. In fact, the inability to establish boundaries often reflects fear rather than love. Fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear of abandonment. The virtuous woman confronts these fears directly. She understands that protecting her peace is not selfish, it is necessary. Because once chaos becomes normalized, the soul begins adapting to dysfunction. What once felt unacceptable slowly becomes tolerated. Then tolerated behavior eventually becomes expected behavior. This is how emotional captivity forms gradually, almost invisibly. But discipline interrupts that progression. A woman of virtue notices patterns early. She pays attention when respect disappears. She pays attention when manipulation becomes habitual. And instead of endlessly rationalizing destructive behavior, she acts with clarity. Sometimes that means difficult conversations. Sometimes it means emotional distance. And sometimes, painfully, it means walking away entirely. That last act is often the narcissist's greatest defeat. Not because he loses control of another person, but because he encounters someone unwilling to participate in the psychological game any longer. A virtuous woman eventually understands that peace purchased through self-betrayal is not peace at all. It is imprisonment disguised as harmony. There is something deeply philosophical beneath this reality. Human beings become shaped by what they repeatedly tolerate. Every compromise of conscience weakens inner stability a little further. Every ignored truth dulls discernment. Every surrendered boundary teaches the soul to accept less than it deserves. And this is why discipline matters so profoundly. Discipline protects identity. It protects clarity. It protects freedom. The narcissist, however, often lives in opposition to discipline. He follows appetite for attention, control, admiration, emotional dominance. He seeks immediate gratification rather than moral responsibility, and because of this, he often mistakes the disciplined person for someone rigid or emotionally detached. In reality, the disciplined person is simply free from slavery to impulse, that freedom becomes impossible to dominate. And perhaps this is the greatest irony of all. The narcissist believes power belongs to the loudest, most controlling, most emotionally intimidating person in the room. But real power often appears quietly. It appears in the person who can remain calm under provocation, in the person who refuses to abandon truth for comfort, in the person who can walk away from toxicity without hatred consuming them. That is strength in its highest form. Because at the end of the day, the narcissist can only control what still craves his approval, fears his rejection, or depends upon his attention. But the woman who has mastered herself, guarded her peace, and learned the courage of boundaries possesses something the narcissist can neither understand nor defeat: a soul no longer available for manipulation,